Just earlier this week, I finished the script for my horror visual novel. Edits are needed, of course, but finishing a first draft is always such a milestone. And this is the first visual novel that I've ever worked on, so let's talk about scripting and the drafting process and the story. First, how I chose to write this script. With a visual novel, you'll often have different branching paths and various endings. I really wanted to keep this one simple, so there are just two main branching paths. At the end of the 4 short opening scenes, you get to make a decision that winds up putting you on the path of one of these 2 branching paths. With these story paths, there are multiple little decisions you can make. Since this is a horror, some of those decisions will lead to your untimely demise, which I guess count as extra endings. Other decisions have less dramatic outcomes, like raising or lowering your relationship level with your best friend, or opening up different dialogue options, or actually concluding a conversation earlier that would have been, different if you had chosen other options, and so on. I chose to write the script in Word, and in full honesty, maybe this isn't the best choice. I do use the different headings and internal link options to try and make it easier to navigate. You can see an example of this on the screen, but honestly, if I was savvier with Excel, that probably would have been a better option, since frankly, this is still pretty hard to get around, and I'm just really used to Word, so this is just kind of me sticking in my comfort zone, which again, maybe not the best idea, especially because there are many scenes that have different variations depending on if your main character is a vampire or a vampire bat or a werewolf, or some scenes even change depending on if you chose to make your best friend a lake monster or a witch. Whenever I get this all edited, somehow I need to move it into RenPy and set up these different variations and make sure that they're all, accessible and that they work, and I don't want to think about that too much right now. So let's talk about how long this took to script. This script is only about 40,000 words, but I did create this file back on May 3rd, and I just finished it on July 21st. So it took about 12 weeks to draft this. And honestly, that's not terrible, but it also isn't great considering I'm intending to try and at least get the demo finished sometime this year. I have written a lot of other stories before, like books, comic scripts, and so on. And for me, drafting is the hardest part, so I am crossing my fingers that editing isn't going to take as long. And this isn't just me. Many writers can be really good at drafting, but they struggle with editing, or they might love editing and hate drafting and it takes forever. So I guess that if you're working on drafting a story, whether it's a visual novel or something else, and it's really hard for you, don't lose hope, because you might have a really great time once you get to editing. However, there is a skill that is necessary in both drafting and editing, particularly editing for content, not grammar and word choice. And that skill is iteration. Iteration in writing, for me, basically means that you have an idea, you critically examine it, maybe you even play with it and see how it works, and then you come up with a better version of that idea. For example, my first working title for this visual novel was Lost in the Woods. I still think that's not a terrible title for a horror game where the main characters are literally and or figuratively lost in a forest, but I tried to draft this story first back in April with basically that premise. The story started with the characters already lost in the woods at night, and soon I realized that made no sense. There are 2 main reasons. The main character is an experienced hiker and camper. She has a lot of experience navigating forests, and also if she's a vampire or vampire bat, she can literally just fly above the tree line to get her bearings, so she's basically too experienced and skilled to just get lost like an ordinary normal person might. Also, the main character would know how dangerous and confusing the forest can be at night, so there's really just no reason she would choose to come to the forest at night. So the story starting with these characters entering the woods at night and getting lost just made no sense whatsoever. And you may be thinking, well, yeah, that's obviously very stupid considering what you already had established about your main character. Why didn't you just realize that while considering the idea and looking at what you already established about your main character? Well, that's the thing about writing. Sometimes you don't realize how idiotic an idea is until you've actually written over 4,000 words about it. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. But anyways, once I realized that this was kind of stupid, I iterated on it and had the story start in the daytime. The characters still wind up in the woods at night due to an unexpected magical accident, so it is no longer a choice that they are making. And I do expect that this story and different aspects of it will also change and evolve even more while I am editing it, because you can do iteration on not just stupid ideas, but also on ideas that are fine but just could be better. When I was younger, I think I resisted iteration, at least to an extent, because I was afraid of my story losing its original sense of identity. Writers base their stories off of a concept or core idea of some kind. This could be anything. It could be a character, it could be a theme, it could be like a question they're trying to answer, or even just an idea based on a genre trope. In my case, the story began because I wanted to do a short horror story within the visual novel format. You might be asking, why horror? I've been trying to write a horror story since 2015. Wow, 10 years. Let's not think about that too much. My first one was about two siblings stuck in an old farmhouse in West Virginia during their summer vacation and experiencing spooky things and making friends with a local who definitely isn't secretly a fairy. Everything about it was bad, except for the farmhouse, which I based off of my mother's childhood home, the setting of West Virginia and the Appalachia, and also the research that I did to try and understand horror. Also, there was a moment where one of the main characters was going to have to win a race in an underground river against a vampire in order to appease the river like gremlin creatures or whatever. There were a lot of cryptids in this story, and having a race with a homicidal vampire is so stupid. I kind of still love that. So, want to know a secret? I can't watch horror films because I will not be able to sleep. Or if I do somehow manage to fall asleep, I will have nightmares. I had nightmares about Five Nights at Freddy's, for crying out loud, and even the scariest moments in that whole franchise are not on the same level as intense, true-to-form horror films. I'm a wimp. However, I knew I needed to see how horror worked if I was going to write a horror. So movies were out, so I was like, maybe I'll just read about it. But I don't really want to read a horror book. Oh, I know! Horror manga! I read horror manga as an attempt to be less frightened. And if you know anything about horror manga, you're probably laughing right now, and I don't blame you. I honestly can't remember all the horror manga that I read, nor do I particularly wish to, but honorable mentions include Junji Ito's Uzumaki, which soured me on spirals for about 3 years and permanently made me hate even the sight of snails. I don't want to see them or think of them. Even now it turns my stomach just to be talking about them, and I want to cry. And I also read Seeds of Anxiety, which is like an anthology of a bunch of little horror short stories, most of which are one-shots, though some are like 2-parters or 3-parters. So this got picked up again by the creator Masaki Nakayama in 2019, and I haven't read any of those new ones. I just read the original 7 volumes. So Seeds of Anxiety shaped my sense of horror in a way I honestly never could have predicted. And not just because the ghost and monster designs are frankly incredible, like the playful man will live in my head forever, even though I really don't want him to, but also just because of how different the stories are. Like, do you have a fear? 9 times out of 10, Seeds of Anxiety has a story about that fear. I have 2 big takeaways from Seeds of Anxiety. First, Japanese ghosts are not just Sadako. The long-haired, angry, dead Japanese woman is like an effective ghost. It is not a bad ghost. But I also do see an over-reliance on it in some horror material. The funniest example of this is creepypastas, where you see young writers trying to draw on this imagery to scare you, and it's so obvious. It's really adorable. Keep trying, kids. Also, these creepypastas over-explain the monsters, which is really funny. And that leads to my second takeaway from Seeds of Anxiety, which is the core of Japanese horror, in my opinion. So Seeds of Anxiety gives you no context or answer about why the ghost is, what it is, how it is, even a lot of the time who it is. That makes it scarier because you can't even try to take actions to avoid the ghost in most cases. And once you encounter it, if you get away, it is pure luck. There's this hilarious example where this gnarly ghoul comes to this man's door and is like, oops, wrong house, and then it just disappears awkwardly into the night. But still, like, why was it there? Who was it looking for? What was it going to do? We don't know. I mean, it looks like a villain from a slasher film, so we can make an educated guess, but still. I learned a lot from reading these different examples of horror manga, and while I am a wuss, I also want to scare others. So I do hope to have some of this sense of the unknowable about what the ghost is, why it is, how it is, and or who it is in horror that I make. So I was planning to say that having a shorter story will hopefully make it possible for me to, you know, keep that sense of mystery, but with 40,000 words in this script so far, that is longer than I had planned and hoped for. I do hope to make it more concise, especially since, again, this will be my first visual novel, and I bet Renpai has a heck of a learning curve, and having fewer words and parts to juggle will hopefully make things more manageable. Because in full honesty, even though this is my first game, I really want it to run as smoothly as butter. Having a computer game crash on me and make my computer start reacting unhappily gives me basically a type of horror that is not in line with the actual type of horror that I wish to provide in my game. It's very anxiety inducing, and I don't want to make any people who play this game feel that way ever. We'll see. Do you enjoy visual novels, or do you enjoy horror? Would you, or have you played any horror visual novels? Or do you read horror manga? If so, bless your heart. Or do you prefer horror movies or something else, or other types of horror video games? Share your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Bye-bye.